Hi, Guy. Tonight we're going somewhere different, somewhere quieter than you might expect for a story about sound, because this isn't really about noise or volume or the loudness of invention. It's about listening, about the space between silence and speech, about a boy who learned to hear differently because someone he loved couldn't hear at all. What follows is a journey through 12 chapters, 12 meditations on sound and silence, on distance and presence, on the human voice and its mysterious journey from breath to electricity to voice again. This is the story of Alexander Graham Bell, but it's also the story of something deeper. The story of how we learned to carry presence across absence, how we made the distant near, how we transformed the human voice from something that required bodies in the same room into something that could span continents, oceans, the very curve of the earth itself. So let the day fall away. Let your breathing slow. Let the noise of the world fade into something softer, something more like listening than hearing. We have 12 chapters ahead, 12 quiet explorations of mystery and persistence, of love and loss, of the sacred work of making the silent heard and the distant present. We begin in a house where silence spoke louder than words, where a mother pressed her hands to piano wood to feel what her ears could no longer translate, where a boy learned his first and most important lesson. That sound was not just hearing, but something that moved through the world in ways the hearing had forgotten to notice. Close your eyes if you want. The story will find you. Let's begin. In a household where words arrived not through air but through eyes and fingertips, a boy learned to listen differently. This was Edinburgh in the middle years of the 19th century, when the city rose grey and dignified from its Scottish hills, when propriety mattered and families maintained appearances even when private griefs ran deep. But in the Bell household, something unusual was occurring, something that would later reshape how humanity understood communication itself, though no one could have predicted this from the domestic scene of a mother at her piano. Eliza Bell sat at the keyboard, her hands pressed flat against the polished wood, not playing exactly, listening. But listening through touch rather than hearing, because her ears had been claimed by illness years before, had been taken from her gradually until sound became memory rather than sensation. She was not born deaf. This matters. She had known sound, had heard music and speech and all the acoustic richness of the world before progressive deafness stole it away, which made the silence more haunting, more present. She remembered what she had lost. Her son Alexander watched from the doorway, watched her hands on the wood, watched how she could distinguish one note from another not by hearing them, but by feeling their vibrations travel through the piano's frame into her palms, her fingers, the bones of her hands. She could tell when he played correctly and when he struck wrong notes, could sense rhythm and tempo through touch alone. The piano became translator, converting acoustic information into tactile sensation, making sound visible or at least perceptible to someone who could not hear it in the conventional way. Whispers tell us that this sight, his mother listening through vibration, perceiving music through channels the hearing world had forgotten existed, became his first and most profound teacher. Not in any formal sense. She did not sit him down and explain the physics of vibration. did not lecture about sound waves or frequency or the mechanical translation of acoustic energy into neural signals. She simply demonstrated through her daily adaptation to deafness that sound was not merely hearing, that it was something more fundamental, something that moved through matter like prayer through stone, like memory through time. His father Melville taught elocution the science of proper speech, the careful shaping of breath into meaning. He had developed a system called visible speech, a way of representing every sound the human mouth could produce through carefully designed symbols. Not writing in the traditional sense, but phonetic notation so precise it could capture accent and dialect, could show exactly how tongue and lips and throat needed to position themselves to create each distinct sound. It is said that the house became a kind of laboratory for communication. Melville would demonstrate visible speech symbols, showing how abstract marks on paper could guide someone to produce sounds they had never heard. Eliza would read lips with remarkable accuracy, could follow conversations by watching mouths move, by observing the subtle choreography of articulation that most people perform unconsciously. And young Alexander absorbed both lessons. From his father, that sound could be made visible, that the invisible mechanics of speech could be represented symbolically. From his mother, that those who could not hear were not lacking but perceiving differently, that deafness was not absence but another form of presence, that communication required more than casual speech when profound silence occupied the space where sound should be. Beneath the silence of that Edinburgh household, beneath the careful articulation and the piano vibrations and the visible speech symbols covering the study walls, something essential was taking root. A boy was learning to see sound not as most people experienced it as something heard and then forgotten, but as something more mysterious, more precious. Something that could be lost, that his mother had lost, that existed in multiple forms and could be translated between them if only one understood the principles governing vibration and perception. The household sounds took on different meaning in this context. When the clock chimed, his mother did not hear it but might feel it if she stood near enough, might sense the vibrations traveling through floorboards. When rain fell, she could not hear the patter against windows but could see the drops, could understand the storm through visual rather than acoustic information. When her sons spoke to her, they had to face her directly, had to articulate clearly so she could read their lips, had to remember always that what came naturally to them, the casual toss of words over shoulders, the conversation conducted while facing away, was impossible for her. Where memory fades into the texture of those childhood years, we can imagine the particular quality of attention this demanded. Most children take hearing for granted, assume that sound simply exists, that words travel through air without effort or consideration. But in a household where the mother could not hear, where communication with her required conscious adjustment, where silence was not merely the absence of sound but a presence in its own right, there, attention deepened. There, the ordinary miracle of acoustic communication became visible through its absence. It is said that he loved her deeply, This mother who could not hear him speak but could read his lips, who could not hear him play piano but could feel through the wood whether he practiced properly. That love would later manifest in dedication to teaching the deaf, in patient work with students who faced the same challenges his mother had faced, in the conviction that those who could not hear deserved not pity but respect, not correction but accommodation. But first, before the teaching and the telephone and all that would come later, there was simply the house. The Edinburgh household where silence spoke in its own language, where vibration mattered more than volume, where a mother's deafness became her son's education in the deeper nature of sound. The piano stood in the parlor, its wood polished and resonant. When it was played, sound radiated in all directions through air for those who could hear, through wood for hands pressed against its frame, through floorboards for feet standing near. Multiple translations of the same acoustic event, each one legitimate, each one real. Perhaps it was never meant to be dramatic, this first lesson in communication's complexity. Perhaps profound education often arrives disguised as ordinary domestic life, as mothers adapting to deafness, as boys watching and wondering why sound exists in forms the hearing rarely notice. Marked by the silence that was not quite silence, by the vibrations that were sound's other name, by the careful articulation required to communicate across the barrier of deafness, the household shaped him. Not through any single moment of revelation, but through accumulated days, through the constant adjustment to his mother's condition, through the recognition that what most people took for granted, the easy flow of speech through air from mouth to ear, was actually miraculous, fragile, contingent on functioning anatomy that could fail, that had failed for someone he loved. The house where silence spoke stood on Edinburgh's respectable streets, looked from outside like any other Victorian dwelling. But inside, different principles governed. Inside, sound was sacred because it was absent. Communication was precious because it required effort. The voice mattered because someone nearby could never hear it conventionally, could only read it from lips or feel it through piano wood or understand it through the careful symbols of visible speech. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. His mother's voice, which he could hear, but she could not, echoed through everything that came after. Through his work with deaf students, through his conviction that sound could be made visible, could be translated from one form to another. Through the telephone itself, which was in some sense an attempt to make voice portable, to separate sound from the body that produced it, to carry acoustic presence across distance the way visible speech carried it across the barrier of deafness. Where wonder begins, love often plants the seed. And in that Edinburgh household, in the silence that surrounded his mother's piano, in the vibrations that let her perceive what her ears could not translate there, love planted questions that would take a lifetime to answer. Questions about sound and silence, about presence and absence, about how the human voice might be captured, transmitted, preserved, made available even to those who could not hear it in traditional ways. The house remembered as houses do. Walls still holding the echo of carefully articulated words, of visible speech lessons, of piano notes felt rather than heard. And in that remembering, the future waited patient and inevitable, ready to be born from the marriage of love and curiosity, of silence and systematic inquiry, of a boy's attention to his mother's deafness and what it taught about sound's deeper nature. Where the journey begins, we rarely see its destination. But the path was already forming there in Edinburgh, in a house where silence spoke and a boy learned to listen. It is said that he became obsessed with visible speech, not his father's system, though that had been the seed, but with the larger question it implied. If sound could be represented symbolically, if the invisible mechanics of articulation could be captured in carefully designed notation, then what else might be possible? Could sound be made visible not just through abstract symbols, but through actual physical representation? Could the air's vibration be translated into form, into pattern, into something eyes could see and hands could touch? The question pursued him through his young manhood, through years spent teaching his father's system to deaf students in London, in Boston, in schools where those who had never heard a voice learned to produce one by following diagrams that mapped the mouth's hidden choreography. He was gifted teacher, patient, systematic, able to break complex processes into manageable steps. His students succeeded where others had failed, learned to speak comprehensibly despite having no acoustic feedback, no way to hear their own voices and adjust accordingly. But teaching was never quite enough. Beneath the pedagogical work, beneath the satisfaction of watching deaf students master speech, a deeper current ran, the question of translation, of how acoustic information might be converted from one form to another, of what principles governed the transformation of vibration into perception, and whether those principles might be harnessed, systematized, made to serve human purposes beyond their natural biological function. Whispers tell us that his experiments grew strange, obsessive in their detail. He attached bristles to tuning forks, let them trace patterns in lamp-black smoke spread thin on glass. Each fork vibrated at a specific frequency, and the bristle recorded that vibration as wavy line visible sound, the acoustic made optical. Different frequencies produced different patterns. The glass plates accumulated these frozen songs, these visual echoes of vibrations that had moved through air and then been captured, translated, made permanent through the simple technique of tracing bristle through smoke. He studied the ear's anatomy with intensity that bordered on reverence. The delicate membrane of the eardrum so thin, so responsive to the minute pressure changes that were sound waves traveling through air. The chain of tiny bones beyond it, hammer, anvil, stirrup, translating membrane vibration into the fluid movements that would eventually become neural signals, become the perception of sound itself. The whole apparatus was translation engine, was proof that vibration could be converted from mechanical to electrical, from physical to perceptual. If nature could accomplish this translation through evolved biological structures, he reasoned, then perhaps artificial membranes might accomplish similar feats. Perhaps wire and diaphragm and magnetic fields could replicate what ear and nerve and brain did naturally. Perhaps sound could be captured not just as visual trace on glass, but as electrical signal in wire, could be transmitted across distance and then translated back into sound at the receiving end. His notebooks filled with sketches, hybrid documents where linguistic notation merged with mechanical diagrams, where the careful symbols of visible speech appeared alongside drawings of electromagnets and vibrating membranes, where the border between teaching and inventing dissolved into singular quest. Everything connected, the deaf students learning to speak, the tuning forks tracing patterns, the ear's anatomy revealing principles of acoustic translation. All of it pointed toward the same possibility. That sound was not fixed in form but could be transformed, transmitted, made to travel through media other than air. Beneath the silence of his Boston laboratory, for by now he had emigrated to America, had established himself as teacher and experimenter, had gathered around him assistants and collaborators who shared his obsession with acoustic phenomena. Beneath that working silence, methodology took shape. Not random experimentation, but systematic investigation. Test one variable at a time, observe results carefully, record everything. Build understanding incrementally through accumulated observations rather than hoping for sudden breakthrough. It is said that he worked mostly at night when the building was quiet, when street noise diminished and the sounds he was trying to capture and transmit would not be masked by ambient interference. His assistant Thomas Watson, skilled electrician and machinist, became essential collaborator. Watson could build what Bell imagined, could translate sketches into actual apparatus, could test and refine mechanisms until they performed as theory predicted they should. Together they explored telegraph technology, the existing infrastructure for electrical communication, the dots and dashes that could already span continents through undersea cables. But telegraph was binary, could send only on-off signals, presence-absence, the crude vocabulary of interrupted current. What Bell sought was richer, the full complexity of the human voice, with all its tones and inflections, its subtle variations of pitch and timbre, its capacity to carry not just information but emotion, personality, the full texture of human presence. Where memory fades into the technical details, the specific configurations of electromagnets, the resistance of wire, the materials used for membranes, there remains the essential drive. The conviction that translation was possible, that sound could ride electric current, that voice could be separated from body and made to travel through copper veins stretching across cities, across states, eventually across oceans and continents. That distance need not mean silence, that separation need not mean isolation, that the human voice could potentially reach anywhere wire could be strung. Perhaps it was never one breakthrough but accumulated understanding. Perhaps the path from deaf students speaking through visible speech to the telephone carrying voice electrically was not leap but gradual incline, each experiment teaching something, each failure narrowing possibilities, each partial success suggesting directions for further investigation. The membrane trembled, in countless configurations, in apparatus assembled and disassembled and reassembled differently. Membranes vibrated in response to voice, to shouted words, to singing, to any acoustic disturbance that could make air pressure fluctuate. And sometimes not reliably yet, not predictably, that vibration would induce current in an electromagnet, would send signal through wire to another apparatus where another membrane might vibrate in sympathy, might reproduce faintly the sound that had set the first membrane trembling. Marked by countless nights of testing, by notebooks filling with observations and calculations, by the slow refinement of mechanism and theory both, the work progressed toward inevitable conclusion. Not inevitable in retrospect only, but inevitable because the principles were sound, because systematic investigation was revealing them, because sufficient persistence would eventually translate possibility into actuality. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The voice he sought to transmit was his mother's, in a sense. The voice she could not hear, that had been lost to her deafness, that he wanted somehow to make available again, not to her hearing, which could not be restored, but perhaps to her touch, to her ability to perceive vibration through alternate channels. If the telephone succeeded, if voice could be transmitted electrically, might it not also be translated into visible or tactile form? Might the deaf somehow benefit from this technology being developed primarily for the hearing? The membrane trembled with meaning beyond its mechanical function. It trembled with memory of his mother's piano, of sound made tangible through vibration. It trembled with accumulated questions from years of teaching deaf students, of wondering how those who could not hear might still access the acoustic richness of human communication. It trembled with the systematic methodology that refused to accept mystery as permanent, that treated the impossible as merely difficult, as problem awaiting sufficient persistence to solve. Where wonder and obsession merged, the telephone was being born, not yet functional, not yet reliable, but approaching through systematic refinement, through patient testing, through the marriage of theoretical understanding and practical mechanism, through nights of work when Boston slept and only the laboratory glowed with lamplight and determination. The membrane trembled, and in that trembling the future whispered its promise. Soon, very soon, the voice would cross the threshold, distance would dissolve. The impossible would become merely historical, would join the catalogue of things that once seemed beyond human capability but proved susceptible to systematic inquiry, to patient persistence, to the refusal to accept silence as inevitable when sound might be made to travel. The membrane trembled, balanced on the edge of transformation. And the world, unknowing, waited for the moment when that trembling would carry meaning across distance, when human voice would first ride electric current, when Alexander Graham Bell's obsession with visible speech would manifest as audible speech traveling where no voice had traveled before, through wire, through separation, through the gap between here and there that was about to become irrelevant. Soon, the membrane promised, soon. In a Boston boarding house attic, on a June afternoon in 1875, the impossible happened so quietly that the world did not immediately notice. The space was cramped, makeshift, not the grand laboratory of later imagination, but a rented room filled with salvaged equipment and improvised apparatus, with wire strung between chambers, with batteries and electromagnets and membranes mounted in wooden frames that Watson had constructed according to Bell's increasingly frantic specifications. They had been working for months, years really, testing configurations that almost worked. Telegraph systems that could send musical tones different pitches that might spell out messages more efficiently than Morse code's dots and dashes. Harmonic telegraph, they called it, and it showed promise enough to attract investors, to keep Bell funded while he pursued the larger dream that obsessed him. Not tones but voice, not simplified signals but the full complexity of human speech. Whispers tell us that something went wrong with the mechanism that afternoon. Or perhaps something went unexpectedly right. The line between failure and breakthrough is often thinner than we imagine, especially in experimental work where the goal itself keeps shifting, where what was being tested becomes less interesting than what accidentally manifests. Watson worked in the distant room, adjusting the receiver, preparing for another test of their harmonic system. A reed had stuck a thin strip of metal that was supposed to vibrate at specific frequency but had become jammed, refusing to move freely. He plucked it to free it, expecting only the local sound of metal springing back into position. But in the other room Bell heard something, faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable, not telegraph signal, not the clean tones of their harmonic system, but the actual sound of Watson plucking the reed, the complex acoustic signature of that specific action, transmitted electrically through the wire connecting the rooms, arriving at Bell's receiver in recognizable form. It is said that Bell's heart stopped for a moment, that he stood frozen, hardly breathing, trying to process what his ears had just reported. They had not yet achieved speech transmission, no words had crossed the wire, no voice had been carried, but sound had traveled. Actual acoustic complexity had been converted to electrical signal, had moved through copper conductor, had been reconverted to vibration audible to human ears. The principle was proven. The rest, making it reliable, making it clear enough to carry intelligible speech, was refinement, was engineering, was the systematic work they already knew how to do. He called Watson to his room, tried to explain what had happened. They experimented, trying to reproduce the effect, to understand exactly what configuration had allowed the transmission. The afternoon faded into evening, evening into night. They worked by lamplight, testing variations, adjusting apparatus, speaking and singing and shouting into the transmitting membrane while the other monitored the receiver, recording which sounds came through clearly and which remained trapped in the sending room. Beneath the silence of those late hours, silence between tests, silence while they adjusted equipment and consulted notes, anticipation built like pressure before storm. They were close. Whatever barrier had prevented acoustic transmission was weakening, was showing cracks through which sound was beginning to leak. One more refinement, one more adjustment, one more reconfiguration might be enough to tear the barrier completely, to open the channel through which voice could finally flow unimpeded by distance. Where memory fades into exhaustion and exhilaration mixed, we can imagine that night's quality. The cramped attic, the smell of oil and metal, and the peculiar scent that electrical discharge leaves in air. The lamplight creating circles of visibility in surrounding darkness. The sense that something momentous was happening even though no proclamations were made, no witnesses present beyond the two of them and their apparatus. What did Bell think about in the quiet moments? Perhaps about his mother, who would never hear the telephone even if it succeeded. Perhaps about the deaf students who had drawn him into this work, who had taught him to value communication because they knew its absence. Perhaps about the pure satisfaction of systematic inquiry yielding results, of patient testing revealing nature's principles, of the conviction that sufficient persistence would translate possibility into actuality. It is said that he barely slept that night. That his mind raced through implications, through the modifications needed to make the transmission clearer, through the vision of what this technology might become if developed fully. A world where voices could span any distance wire could reach, where separation no longer meant isolation, where the human voice, that most intimate of productions, could be made as portable as written words, as transmissible as telegraph messages, but infinitely richer in content and emotion. The attic where distance dissolved was unmarked, unremarkable. No plaque commemorated what had occurred there. The boarding house has long since been demolished, replaced by buildings whose inhabitants never knew that in the attic of the structure they displaced, the modern world had taken decisive step toward its current form. But the moment persisted in notebooks documenting the breakthrough. In letters Bell wrote to his backers describing the achievement. In the renewed determination with which he and Watson attacked the remaining problems standing between experimental success and practical technology. Marked by the faint sound of a plucked reed traveling through wire, by acoustic information converted to electrical signal and back again, by the proof that what they had theorized was actually possible. Marked by all this, the afternoon became threshold. Before it, telephone was hopeful speculation, was vision lacking confirmation, was dream pursued but not yet proven. After it, telephone was simply engineering problem, was mechanism needing refinement rather than principle needing proof, was inevitable rather than impossible. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. That afternoon in the Boston attic, the echo of Watson's plucked reed carried more than acoustic information. It carried the future. It carried the eventual telephone network that would span continents. It carried the transformation of human communication from something bound by proximity to something limited only by infrastructure. It carried all the conversations that would be possible once the technology matured, all the connections that would be maintained across distance, all the presence that would persist despite separation. The attic was small. The moment was quiet. But what began there rippled outward in waves that would reshape civilization, that would make distance increasingly irrelevant to human relationship, that would prove once more that systematic investigation could overcome apparently insurmountable barriers. Where wonder lives, boundaries dissolve. The boundary between here and there, between sound at its source and sound at distance, between the impossible and the merely difficult, between theory and practice. All of them weakening, cracking, preparing to fall before the systematic assault of patient experimentation and refined apparatus. The afternoon faded into legend, but the attic remained for a time just an attic. Watson's tools on the workbench, Bell's notebooks on the desk, wire strung between rooms. The apparatus that had carried that first sound waiting to carry others, waiting to be refined and improved until it could carry not just plucked reeds but human voices, not just simple sounds but complex speech, not just proof of concept but practical, reliable, everyday communication. Distance had dissolved, not completely, not yet, but enough to prove it could be done, enough to show that the work was worth continuing. Enough to transform hope into certainty, vision into engineering project, impossible into inevitable. In that transformation, in that quiet afternoon breakthrough, the telephone was truly born, not in the later, more famous transmission of words, but here, in the accident of a stuck reed, in the sound that crossed the threshold between rooms and proved that sound could cross any threshold given the right apparatus and sufficient understanding. The attic remembered, though the building itself would not long survive, and in that memory preserved in notebooks, in patents, in the eventual technology that emerged from that afternoon's discovery, the future waited, patient and inevitable, ready to speak across any distance, ready to dissolve the tyranny of separation, ready to make the human voice as portable as human thought. Where the impossible became possible, a door opened. And through that door, the modern world would eventually walk, talking as it went, voices carrying across miles and continents and oceans, connected by copper wire and systematic persistence, and the refusal of one man and his assistant to accept that distance must mean silence. The attic where distance dissolved stands now only in memory. But what it proved persists, echoing through every telephone call, through every voice that travels electrically, through every conversation that spans distance as though distance were irrelevant. And in that persistence, wonder lives eternal. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." It is said that these were the first words ever transmitted electrically, carried through wire from one room to another, from Bell's lips to Watson's ear across distance that should have meant silence. Not poetry, not proclamation, not carefully prepared statement meant for history's recording. Just casual summons, spoken because he had spilled battery acid on his clothes and needed assistance, because in the moment of pain and surprise he forgot he was supposed to be testing apparatus and simply called out to his colleague in the adjacent room, and the apparatus answered. The date was March 10, 1876, a Tuesday. Evening settling over Boston, the boarding house growing quiet as residents finished supper and retired to their rooms. In the makeshift laboratory, Bell worked alone, Watson stationed in the distant chamber, waiting by the receiver, ready to report whatever sounds might come through. They had made modifications since that June afternoon when the plucked reed had traveled through wire, had refined the membrane, adjusted the electromagnet, changed the configuration of transmitter and receiver based on accumulated observations. Tonight was to be another test, another attempt to send recognizable speech across the wire. They had succeeded with individual sounds, with sustained tones, with fragments that suggested words but never quite achieved intelligibility. But complete sentences clear enough to be understood without guessing, without context filling gaps the technology could not yet bridge, these remained elusive. Whispers tell us that the acid spill was accident, pure mischance. A bottle tipped, liquid splashing across his leg, the sharp sensation demanding immediate attention. Without thinking, without remembering he was supposed to speak carefully into the transmitter, he called out, voice raised, urgent, the natural cry of someone needing help. In the other room Watson heard, not distorted fragments, not ambiguous sounds requiring interpretation, but actual words, Bell's actual voice recognizably present despite his body's absence. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Clear enough to understand, distinct enough to identify the speaker. Complete enough to convey both information and urgency. Watson came running, not because of the acid, he did not yet know about that, but because he understood what had occurred. The boundary had been crossed, the impossible had been accomplished. Human speech had traveled electrically, had been transformed from acoustic vibration into electrical signal and back into sound comprehensible to human ears. The telephone, which had been theoretical possibility, hoped for invention, vision pursued but not yet realized, the telephone now existed, now worked, now proved that distance need not mean the end of conversation. Beneath the silence that followed the pause after Watson burst into the room, after they realized what had just happened, the world changed, not immediately in any visible way. The boarding house remained a boarding house. Boston continued its evening routines. Nothing appeared different because nothing was yet different for anyone beyond the two men in that attic laboratory. But the potential had shifted. What had been impossible was now merely new. What had seemed forever limited to short distances, the range of unaided voice, perhaps amplified by shouting, but still constrained to hundreds of feet at most, could now theoretically span any distance wire could reach. The human voice had become portable, had been freed from the body that produced it, had proven itself capable of electrical translation and transmission. It is said that they tested it again and again that night, speaking back and forth between rooms. Simple sentences at first, greetings, questions, statements chosen for their clarity. Then more complex speech, longer phrases, conversational exchanges that felt almost normal except for the wire connecting them, except for the knowledge that what they were doing had never been done before, that they were the first humans ever to conduct conversation through electrical transmission of voice. The words accumulated like evidence. Each successful transmission strengthening the case that this was not fluke but repeatable phenomenon, not accident but technology that could be refined and made reliable. They noted which types of sounds transmitted most clearly, which volumes worked best, how close to the membrane one needed to speak for optimal transmission. All the practical details that would need to be resolved before the telephone could become more than laboratory demonstration. Where memory fades into the excitement of those late hours, we can imagine the quality of realization dawning. This was not improvement on telegraph, not merely faster way to send messages. This was fundamentally different, the transmission of voice itself, with all its tones and inflections, its capacity to carry emotion and personality, its intimate connection to the person speaking. The telephone would not replace face-to-face conversation, but it might come close, might preserve something of presence despite distance. Perhaps Bell thought of his mother that night, how the telephone could never truly help her, could never overcome her deafness, how this invention that would later make him famous and wealthy was fundamentally inaccessible to the person whose condition had initially drawn him toward acoustic investigation. There was melancholy in this, a sense that the work had drifted from its original motivation even as it succeeded beyond initial hopes. But there was triumph, too. The pure satisfaction of systematic inquiry yielding breakthrough, of patient testing revealing nature's principles, of conviction proven correct through empirical demonstration. He had believed this was possible, had pursued it despite skepticism, despite the reasonable objection that if transmitting voice electrically were possible, someone would surely have done it already, had persisted through failures and setbacks and experiments that almost worked but didn't quite, and now, finally, the persistence had been rewarded. The voice had crossed the threshold. Distance had dissolved before the power of electrical transmission. The impossible had become actual in that March evening, in that boarding house attic, in words spoken urgently because of spilled acid and heard clearly because the mechanism finally, at last, worked as theory predicted it should. Marked by those first transmitted words, casual, urgent, unaware of their own historical significance, the evening became origin point. Before it, telephone was hope and hypothesis. After it, telephone was technology requiring development but no longer requiring proof. The principle was established. The rest was refinement, was scaling from laboratory to infrastructure, was the business and legal challenges of transforming experimental success into commercial service. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you. The words echo still, not just in historical memory, but in every telephone conversation since. Every call made, every voice transmitted electrically, every instance of presence maintained despite separation, all of them descendants of that first transmission, all of them proving again what Bell and Watson proved that March evening. The words themselves were ordinary, but their journey was not. They traveled through transformation from acoustic pressure waves in air to mechanical vibration of membrane, from membrane vibration to electrical current in wire, from electrical signal to mechanical motion of receiving membrane, from membrane back to acoustic waves arriving at Watson's ear. 4 translations, each one necessary, each one preserving something essential even as the medium changed. It is said that Bell filed for patent the very next day, or perhaps it was weeks later. The historical record is unclear, but soon, certainly. The invention needed protection, needed legal recognition. needed the formal acknowledgement that what had been accomplished was novel, was significant, was worthy of the monopoly rights that patents granted. The legal battles would come later, rivals claiming they had invented the telephone first, investors arguing over shares of eventual profits, courts trying to determine whose contributions were essential and whose merely supportive. But none of that mattered on the night of March 10, 1876. What mattered was simpler, purer. The voice had traveled. Words had crossed distance electrically. The telephone worked. Where wonder lives, transformation occurs. The transformation of sound into signal, of distance into irrelevance, of impossible into accomplished fact. The boarding house attic held witness to this transformation, its walls absorbing the significance even if they could not comprehend it, its floors bearing the weight of apparatus that had just reshaped human civilization's future. The acid stain remained on Belle's pants, practical reminder that great moments often arrive accidentally, that breakthrough can come from mistake or urgency rather than careful preparation. The stain would eventually wash out or the pants would be discarded. But what the accident had enabled would persist, would spread, would eventually connect the world in ways Belle could only begin to imagine that night. Beneath the silence after Watson departed, after the excitement had settled enough for Belle to clean up the spilled acid, to record the day's events in his notebook, to sit alone with the magnitude of what had been accomplished beneath that silence, gratitude perhaps stirred. Gratitude for Watson's skill and patience, for the investors who had funded the work, for his father's visible speech system that had started him thinking about sound's translation, for his mother's deafness that had made communication sacred rather than casual, for all the accumulated chances and choices that had led to this moment, this attic, this breakthrough. The words crossed the threshold on March 10, 1876. But their crossing opened door that would never close, that would only widen as the technology spread, as telephone service became infrastructure, as the world shrank before the power of voice transmitted electrically across distances that once meant isolation. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Simple words, urgent words. Words that changed everything by proving that words could travel, that voice could persist despite distance, that the human presence could be electrically transmitted and received and recognized across separations that should have meant silence. In those words, the modern world spoke its first sentence. Then the echo continues still through every telephone call, through every voice that travels copper or fiber, through every conversation that treats distance as irrelevance rather than obstacle. Where the threshold was crossed, a new path opened. And humanity, perhaps without fully realizing it, stepped through into the connected future, talking as it went, voices carrying across the wire, presence maintained despite separation, the impossible made so ordinary that within a generation it would be taken for granted, would be forgotten as miracle and remembered only as utility. But on that March evening in that Boston boarding house, the miracle was fresh and new. And in its freshness, wonder bloomed pure, undiminished by familiarity, recognizing in those simple transmitted words the beginning of transformation that would reshape how humans related to distance, to separation, to the challenge of maintaining connection across the spaces that divide us. The words crossed, and in their crossing everything changed. She could not hear him. His wife Mabel had been deaf since childhood, since scarlet fever invaded her body at age 5, since the illness retreated but took her hearing with it, leaving her in silence before memory could properly preserve what sound had been. She did not remember her mother's voice, did not remember music or birdsong or any of the acoustic richness that most people inhabited without conscious appreciation. For her, the world was visual, tactile, observed rather than overheard. He had been her teacher first. This was years before the telephone, when he was still young man establishing himself as instructor of the deaf, carrying forward his father's work with visible speech, helping those who could not hear learn to produce comprehensible speech by following phonetic notation that showed exactly how mouth and tongue and throat should position themselves. Mabel was exceptional student, intelligent, determined, refusing to let deafness limit her education or social participation. But student became something more, perhaps inevitably, given the hours they spent together, given the intimacy of teaching speech, of guiding her articulation, of communicating through lip reading and careful enunciation. He fell in love with her. She more gradually came to return his feeling. Her parents worried about the age difference, about his limited financial prospects, about whether this intense young teacher with his obsessive interest in acoustic phenomena could provide the stability their daughter deserved. They married anyway. In 1877, the year after the telephone's invention, when his fame was beginning to spread but his fortune was not yet secure. She was 20, he was 30. Their marriage would last until his death 4 to 5 years later, would produce 4 children, would become partnership of different perceptions working toward common purpose. Whispers tell us that their communication developed its own grammar, its own rhythms different from hearing couples. He learned to speak slowly and clearly, to face her directly so she could read his lips, to understand that casual conversation, words tossed over shoulders, remarks made while facing away, was impossible with her. She learned to sense the presence of sound through alternate channels, through watching how others reacted to noises she could not hear, through feeling vibrations in furniture and floors, through developing the heightened visual attention that deaf people often cultivate. In their home in Washington, they built life around accommodation and understanding. Servants learned to approach her from the front rather than calling from behind. Visitors were briefed about her deafness, about the need to speak clearly and face her directly. The social gatherings were challenging. She could not follow group conversations, could not catch remarks not directed specifically to her. But she adapted, participated, refused to let deafness confine her to domestic isolation. Beneath the silence of their domestic life, silence that was hers constantly, his only when they were alone together, something tender and melancholic developed. When the telephone brought him fame and fortune, when the world celebrated his invention of long-distance speech, When newspapers proclaimed him genius for making voice portable, she remained the one person in his life who could never use his device, could never hear his voice transmitted across wire, could never benefit directly from the technology that made his reputation. There was something both touching and tragic in this. He had dedicated early career to making sound visible, to helping the deaf communicate, but his greatest invention served only the hearing world. For Mabel, for his mother, for all the deaf students he had taught, the telephone was irrelevant, was miracle that bypassed them entirely, was triumph that reminded them of what they lacked. It is said that he recognized this irony, perhaps felt guilt about it. That his later work often returned to questions of how sound might be translated into forms accessible to the deaf. He experimented with devices that would convert speech into visible patterns, into tactile sensations, into any representation that might allow those without hearing to access spoken communication. None of these devices achieved the success or reach of the telephone. But the attempt mattered, spoke to his continuing concern for the population that had first drawn him into acoustic investigation. Where memory fades into the texture of their married years, we can imagine the quality of their relationship, the patience required, the accommodations made, the ways love manifests differently when one partner inhabits a sensory world the other can never fully enter. He could describe sounds to her, but description is not experience. She could never know his voice the way hearing people knew it, could only read his lips, could only understand his words through vision rather than audition. Their garden in Nova Scotia became sanctuary. At Bainbrig, their summer estate overlooking Bras d'Or Lake, they created space where her deafness was not disability but simply condition, where the household adapted to her needs rather than expecting her to struggle constantly with a hearing world's assumptions. The garden paths they walked together in silence, his silence voluntary, hers permanent, became their own form of communication, not requiring words, not demanding speech, just presence, companionship, the understanding that develops between people who have chosen each other and committed to navigating whatever challenges that choice brings. It is said that she supported his work even when it took him away for long periods, even when his obsessions with flight and hydrofoils and countless subsidiary interests left her managing household and children alone. That she understood his need to question, to investigate, to refuse to let any mystery remain permanently closed. That their partnership worked because they had established from the beginning that her deafness was fact to be accommodated rather than problem to be solved, that she was complete person rather than someone lacking, that silence was her natural state rather than deprivation requiring constant remedy. Marked by the silence that she inhabited and he visited, their marriage became testament to the possibility of connection across profound difference. They could not share the acoustic dimension of existence, could not both appreciate music or bird song or the subtle sounds that give texture to daily life. But they shared vision, touch, the visual communication of expression and gesture. They shared commitment to family and the causes they both valued: education for the deaf, scientific investigation, the conviction that understanding could be systematically pursued. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. In the silence of their garden, in the patient adaptation of their communication, in the tender accommodation each made to the other's perceptual world, there, a different kind of voice spoke. Not acoustic but relational, not transmitted through wire but through the daily choices of respect and patience and love that persists across fundamental difference. Where wonder and melancholy mingled, their partnership flourished. The wonder of connection maintained despite her deafness. The melancholy of what could not be shared, of the acoustic dimension forever closed to her. But wonder predominated, the recognition that love does not require perfect communication, that presence matters more than capacity to hear, that the silence she inhabited was not void but simply different space, equally valid, equally capable of holding relationship and meaning. Beneath the silence of her world, he learned lessons that no amount of acoustic investigation could teach. That communication was more than sound transmission. That presence persisted across sensory difference. That the human voice, though important, was not the only or even the most essential form of connection. That touch and vision and patient attention could carry meaning that sound alone could never convey. The garden of silent voices held them both, his voice silent to her except through lip reading, through the visual representation of articulation. Her voice which she had learned to produce through his teaching, but could not hear to modulate silent to herself though audible to others. And in that mutual silence, in that meeting of different perceptual worlds, something beautiful persisted. Proof that relationship could bridge any gap, that love could translate across difference, that the borders separating one consciousness from another were permeable despite everything, despite even the profound isolation that deafness might seem to impose. Where memory fades into the accumulated years of their marriage, the garden remains physical space in Nova Scotia and metaphorical space in memory. The place where silence was not absence but presence, where different ways of perceiving were honored rather than judged, where he learned what his mother's deafness had first suggested, that those who cannot hear are not lacking but perceiving differently, that silence has its own language, its own wisdom, its own contribution to make to the conversation that love becomes. Some believe his telephone was love letter to his wife and mother, attempt to connect the world the way he wished he could connect with them, through sound, through voice, through the acoustic presence that deafness made impossible. Others believe his greatest invention was not the telephone at all, but the patient, respectful partnership he built with Mabel, the marriage that honored difference rather than trying to erase it, that adapted and accommodated rather than demanding the deaf become hearing, the silent become speaking. Beneath the silence hers permanent, his when they were together, both of them when they walked the garden paths in Nova Scotia evening light, understanding grew. Understanding that sound was not everything, that voice though precious was not essential to connection, that the telephone, for all its transformative power, could not replace presence, could not substitute for the patient attention that real relationship demands. The garden held them both. And in that holding, silence spoke its own truth, that connection transcends medium, that love finds ways across any barrier, that the distance between one consciousness and another can be bridged even when sound cannot travel, when hearing is absent, when the acoustic dimension is closed permanently. Where the garden grows, silence blooms. And in that blooming, something eternal persists, the recognition that we are not defined by what we lack but by how we adapt, that communication takes many forms, that presence matters more than any particular sense, that love speaks in languages beyond sound and is heard most clearly in the silence where patient attention dwells. After the telephone's triumph, he could have rested, could have lived comfortably on royalties and fame, basked in recognition, enjoyed the fruits of invention without seeking further mysteries to solve. But his mind would not settle, could not settle. The telephone had answered one question: how to transmit voice through wire, but in answering, it had raised others. If sound could travel through electrical current in copper, he wondered, why not through light? It is said that the idea obsessed him through the late 1870s and early 1880s, even as telephone service was expanding, even as his invention was transforming from laboratory curiosity to commercial infrastructure. Light was electromagnetic radiation, just as electricity was. Light traveled vast distances without medium, crossed emptiness where sound could never reach, spanned the gulf between stars where no wire could ever be strung. Could light be modulated to carry acoustic information? Could a beam of light become a telephone line, transmitting voice without copper, carrying speech through pure radiance? The photophone emerged from these questions, a device stranger and more visionary than the telephone itself, a technology so far ahead of its time that it would not become practical for nearly a century, until fiber optics and lasers made the underlying principle finally useful. But in 1880, working with his assistant Charles Sumner Tainter, he built apparatus that demonstrated the possibility, that proved light could indeed carry the human voice across distance without physical connection. Whispers tell us that the principle was elegant, almost mystical in its simplicity. Sunlight reflected from a mirror struck a thin, flexible membrane. When someone spoke near the membrane, voice vibrations caused it to flex, modulating the reflected beam, making it brighter and dimmer in patterns corresponding to the acoustic pressure waves. At the receiving end, another apparatus detected these modulations using a selenium cell, whose electrical resistance varied with light intensity, translating the modulated beam back into electrical signal that could drive a speaker and reproduce the original sound. The device worked. Voices transmitted across distances on beams of light. No wire required, no physical connection between sender and receiver, just mirror and membrane, selenium and sunlight, the invisible modulation of reflected radiance carrying speech through emptiness. They demonstrated it over 200 meters, voices crossing courtyard gardens, transmitted through afternoon light, arriving at the receiver clear enough to be understood despite the improbability, despite the seeming impossibility of voice-writing radiance. But the photophone, for all its elegance, remained laboratory curiosity. Too dependent on whether clouds blocked transmission, rain scattered light, fog rendered the system useless. Too demanding of clear sightlines, buildings or trees, or any obstruction between sender and receiver meant silence. Too limited by distance, atmospheric interference and geometric spreading reduced beam intensity rapidly, limiting practical range to hundreds of meters rather than the miles that wire-based telephony could easily span. Beneath the silence of the photophone's commercial failure, something profound had been proven. That light could carry information. That voice could ride radiance. That electromagnetic waves, whether electrical current in wire or optical radiation through air, could be modulated to preserve and transmit acoustic complexity. The principle was sound even if the implementation was premature, even if the technology of the 1880s could not make the vision practical. It is said that Bell considered the photophone his greatest achievement, more elegant than the telephone, more ambitious, more aligned with his deepest vision of communication freed from physical constraint. The telephone still required wires, still depended on infrastructure of copper and poles and switchboards. But the photophone needed only line of sight and light source and the apparatus to modulate and detect. In some idealized future, he imagined, buildings would communicate through light beams carrying thousands of conversations simultaneously, each beam a highway of voices traveling through air without the clutter and expense of wire. That future would arrive, but not in his lifetime. Not until fiber optic cables, thin strands of glass carrying laser light modulated with billions of bits per second, made his vision finally practical. Not until the 1970s and 80s would the photophone's principle become foundation for telecommunications infrastructure, would light-based communication prove superior to electrical for long-distance transmission of information. But the seed had been planted in 1880, in that courtyard garden where voice first rode beam of reflected sunlight, where the impossible was demonstrated even if it could not yet be made reliable. Where memory fades into the technical complexities, the precise formulation of selenium cells, the optimal membrane materials, the challenge of keeping mirror and receiver properly aligned despite wind and temperature changes, there remains the essential audacity. The willingness to ask whether light might serve purposes usually assigned to electricity. The refusal to accept that the telephone's success meant investigation was complete, that the question of voice transmission had been finally answered rather than merely addressed in one particular way. Perhaps it was never meant to be practical in its original form. Perhaps the photophone existed to point beyond itself, to suggest possibilities that later generations would realize, to prove a principle that could not yet be properly exploited. There is value in premature invention, in technology that arrives before its time. It stakes claim to territory that will later be settled. It suggests directions that seem impractical until supporting technologies develop, marked by the beam flickering with human speech, by light modulated to carry meaning across distance, by the demonstration that electromagnetic radiation in any form could serve as medium for voice transmission. The photophone joined Bell's catalog of achievements. Not his most famous, not his most commercially successful, but perhaps his most visionary, the one that looked furthest into the future, that anticipated technologies he would never see realized, that proved once more his particular gift for seeing in nature's principles possibilities that others overlooked. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The photophone whispered truths about light and communication that the 1880s could not fully appreciate. That wireless transmission was possible, that infrastructure was not destiny, that the principles governing electrical communication applied more broadly than the telephone's specific implementation suggested. These truths waited decades to be properly understood, to find technological context that could make them practical. But the waiting diminished nothing. The photophone had proven its point, had demonstrated that voice could ride light, had shown that electromagnetic waves in any frequency could carry information if properly modulated and detected. The rest making it reliable, making it practical, scaling from laboratory to infrastructure. These were questions for later generations equipped with better materials and more sophisticated understanding. Beneath the silence of commercial failure, scientific success persisted. The photophone worked. The principle was sound. That it did not transform into immediate practical application was limitation of contemporary technology, not flaw in underlying concept. And Bell, perhaps alone among his contemporaries, understood this. Understood that the photophone's failure to achieve commercial success did not mean failure absolutely. That proving possibility mattered even when implementation remained elusive. Where wonder lives, vision reaches beyond present capability. The photophone reached beyond the 1880s, beyond Bell's lifetime, toward the fiber optic networks that now carry most long-distance communication, toward the lasers that have made light-based transmission the standard rather than curiosity. In reaching beyond its time, it became prophecy predicting not just technology but principle, not just specific application but general truth about the versatility of electromagnetic radiation as information medium. The beam carried song through emptiness. Literally, they transmitted not just speech but music through the photophone, sent melodies across courtyards on modulated light, proved that any acoustic complexity could ride the beam if the modulation was precise enough. And in that carrying, in that transmission of human voice and song through pure radiance, the future spoke its promise, not immediately fulfilled, not quickly realized, but inevitable nonetheless, waiting for the right moment, the right supporting technologies, the right confluence of capability and need. Some believe the photophone was distraction, was tangent from the important work of developing telephone service, was indulgence of curiosity when practical matters demanded attention. But perhaps all great advances require such indulgences. Perhaps the willingness to pursue tangents is what distinguishes systematic innovation from mere refinement. Perhaps the photophone mattered not for what it immediately accomplished, but for what it suggested, for the questions it raised, for the directions it pointed. Where the beam flickered with human speech, the future was already present, not manifest, not realized, but implicit, waiting. And in that waiting, in that patient hibernation of a century before the principle became practical, the photophone served its purpose, not as commercial product, not as practical technology, but as proof, as demonstration, as stake planted in territory that would later be thoroughly explored and settled. The beam carried song through emptiness, and in that carrying, silence learned a new language, the language of modulated light, of information riding radiance, of presence transmitted through electromagnetic waves that asked nothing from the emptiness they crossed except permission to travel unobstructed. Where wonder reaches, possibility expands. The photophone expanded possibility beyond what the 1880s could accommodate, but expansion mattered more than accommodation. The vision mattered more than immediate practicality. The proof mattered more than contemporary commercial success. And so the photophone stands in memory not as failure but as prophecy, not as dead end but as signpost pointing toward future that Bell could imagine but not inhabit, toward technologies he could foresee but not create, toward the inevitable moment when light would become the primary medium for long-distance communication, when his photophone's principle would finally find the practical expression it always deserved. The beam carried song. And the song continues, though now through glass fibers rather than open air, through laser light rather than reflected sunlight, through networks spanning continents rather than courtyard gardens. But the principle remains: light can carry voice, radiance can transmit presence, electromagnetic waves are versatile beyond any single application. Where the journey began, in that 1880 courtyard, the destination was already implicit. The photophone knew where it was going even if its inventor could not live to see arrival. And in that knowing, patient and persistent, the future waited, silent but present, impossible but inevitable, ahead of its time, but precisely on time for the moment when time finally caught up to vision. In later years, he turned to flight, to the ancient dream of human bodies airborne, of weight defeated through wing or engine or clever manipulation of aerodynamic principles that nature had mastered in birds and insects, but humanity had only recently begun to understand. At Baddeck, his Nova Scotia estate perched above Brasdoor Lake, he built enormous kites that looked like nothing the sky had seen before. It is said that he became fascinated by structure itself, not just how things flew, but why they held together while flying, why some shapes remained stable under stress while others collapsed. The tetrahedral cell became his obsession. A pyramid built from 6 struts forming 4 triangular faces, the simplest three-dimensional structure that distributes force evenly across all its members. Individual cells were simple enough, but when combined into larger assemblies, when connected together into frameworks of hundreds or thousands of cells, they created structures that were simultaneously strong and light, that resisted bending and twisting while remaining light enough to float on air. The kites grew massive. Not toys but serious investigations into structural stability, into how geometric principles might inform engineering, into whether the mathematics of repeated forms could yield practical benefits for flight. He called them Cygnet, the young swan, these enormous cellular constructions that rose above the Nova Scotia landscape like geometric clouds, like mathematical dreams made tangible through wood and silk and careful assembly. Whispers tell us that visitors to Bainbrig found the kites disturbing, unnatural. They did not look like conventional aircraft, did not resemble birds or even the box kites that were common enough. Instead, they appeared almost alien, repeating pyramidal cells creating honeycomb structures, frameworks that seemed more architecture than flying machine, that suggested industrial aesthetic rather than natural form. But Bell was not interested in mimicking nature. He wanted to understand principles, the mathematics of structural efficiency, the geometry of distributed load-bearing, the engineering truths that could be extracted from systematic variation and observation. Each kite was experiment. Each variation tested a hypothesis about how cells should be connected, how large the overall structure could grow while maintaining stability, how much weight the framework could carry while remaining light enough for wind to lift. Beneath the silence of those mountain afternoons, silence broken by wind singing through cell frameworks, by the creak of silk and wood under tension, by the occasional sharp crack when a strut failed and had to be replaced, beneath that working silence, methodology prevailed. The same systematic approach that had yielded the telephone and photophone now applied to aeronautics. Observe, hypothesize, test, record results, modify based on what was learned, test again. It is said that the kites achieved remarkable lift. Assemblies of thousands of cells, frameworks weighing hundreds of pounds, rising smoothly into air and pulling so hard on their tethers that men had to anchor them to prevent escape. Some were large enough to carry human passengers' assistants who volunteered to ascend into the sky while Bell photographed from below, documenting everything, recording data about wind conditions and structural behavior, and the sensation of flight that those who rode the kites reported. The experience was apparently terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Rising above the lake, suspended beneath a geometric framework, feeling the structure flex and creak, knowing that nothing but the mathematics of triangulated cells stood between you and catastrophic failure. But the structures held. The cells distributed stress as theory predicted they should, and slowly, through accumulated flights and observations, understanding grew about what worked and what didn't, about how large these cellular kites could become before weight overcame lift. Where memory fades into the technical specifics, the optimal angle for connecting cells, the best materials for struts and covering, the ratio of cell size to overall structure that yielded maximum efficiency, there remains the essential image. The enormous kites rising against Canadian sky. The old man watching from below, notebooks in hand, still questioning, still investigating, still refusing to accept mystery as permanent when patient observation might reveal principles. Perhaps it was never meant to achieve practical aviation. The Wright brothers' approach, focused, minimalist, iteratively refined, proved more immediately successful, more practical for developing controllable powered flight. Their Flyer of 1903 succeeded where Bell's tetrahedral kites remained experiments, demonstrations, investigations rather than transportation, but Bell's approach explored different questions. Questions about scale and structure, about how to build large, lightweight frameworks that could resist stress, about whether nature's cellular patterns, honeycomb, bone structure, plant tissue could inform human engineering. These questions, though they did not immediately yield practical aircraft, would later matter for buildings and bridges, for lightweight structures that needed strength without weight, for the entire discipline of structural engineering that emerged in the 20th century. Marked by the strange geometry of those kites, by the pyramidal cells repeated in frameworks that seemed to tessellate space itself, by the vision of cellular structures growing arbitrarily large while maintaining stability, the aeronautical experiments became another chapter in Bell's catalogue of investigations. Not his most successful, not the work for which he would be primarily remembered, but characteristic nonetheless, the same curiosity, the same systematic methodology, the same conviction that nature's principles could be discovered through patient observation and variation. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The kites whispered truths about structure that the early 20th century was only beginning to understand. That strength comes from distribution rather than mass. That cellular patterns achieve efficiency impossible for solid forms. That the mathematics of repeated geometry yield emergent properties, the framework as a whole becoming stronger than any individual cell, the assembly gaining capabilities that no component possesses. Beneath the silence of those abandoned experiments, for eventually the kites were dismantled, the framework cells separated and stored, the investigations into tetrahedral structures set aside as Bell's attention moved to other questions. Beneath that silence, legacy persisted. In photographs of the strange geometric kites, in notebooks documenting their construction and behavior, in the influence they had on architects and engineers who saw the images and wondered whether cellular structures might serve purposes beyond flight. Where wonder and impracticality meet, vision often dwells. The tetrahedral kites were impractical as aircraft, too heavy for their lift, too large and unwieldy for practical control, too dependent on specific wind conditions. But as vision, as demonstration of principle, as suggestion of what cellular structures might accomplish in these ways, they succeeded. Pointed directions, raised questions, suggested that the path to flight, to structural efficiency, to lightweight strength, might pass through geometry and repetition rather than through mimicry of biological forms. The mountain where metal birds were born was not literally metal. The kites were wood and silk, organic materials carefully assembled. But they were mechanical rather than biological, geometric rather than aerodynamic, mathematical rather than mimetic. In that difference lay their peculiar character, their strangeness, their suggestion that flight might be achieved through multiple paths, that nature's way was not the only way, that human engineering could discover principles nature had not explored. Some believe the aeronautical work was regression, was old man's retreat from the cutting edge of technology into hobby that promised no commercial return. But perhaps it was something else, continuation of lifelong pattern, the restless curiosity that could not settle, that ranged across disciplines seeking connections, seeking principles, seeking the systematic understanding that comes from questioning everything rather than specializing narrowly. Where the kites rose, questions rose with them. Questions about structure and scale, about geometry and force, about how repeated simple forms could yield complex emergent properties. And in those questions, in that patient investigation of structural principles, Bell remained himself the systematic questioner, the patient investigator, the one who treated no mystery as permanently closed, who believed sufficient observation would eventually reveal nature's principles. The metal birds or wooden and silk birds or geometric clouds, depending on how one saw them, these strange artifacts of Bell's later years stand in memory as testament to curiosity that ranged beyond any single discipline, that refused to be contained by success in one domain, that continued seeking and questioning long after most would have rested on their laurels. Where the mountain rises above the lake, the ghost of those kites still flies not physically but in memory, in photographs, in the questions they raised about structure and flight, and whether human engineering might find its own path rather than simply copying nature's solutions. And in that ghost flight, in that remembered rising of geometric forms against Canadian sky, something persists, the recognition that inquiry itself matters more than any particular outcome, that the questions asked shape understanding even when answers prove elusive, that the systematic pursuit of principle is worthy endeavor regardless of commercial application. The mountain where metal birds were born holds its secrets still. But the birds themselves, those strange tetrahedral assemblies, spoke truths that would echo forward into architectural and engineering disciplines, would influence how later generations thought about structure and strength, would demonstrate once more that systematic investigation yields understanding even when it does not yield immediately practical devices. Where wonder flew, wisdom followed. And in the following, the tetrahedral kites found their purpose not as aircraft but as teachers, not as transportation but as demonstration, not as commercial products, but as evidence that systematic questioning of nature's principles will always yield something valuable, even if that something arrives in unexpected forms. On a frozen lake in Nova Scotia, February 1909, a fragile craft of spruce and fabric rose from ice. The Silver Dart, designed and piloted by his protege J.A.D. McCurdy, became the first airplane flown in Canada, the first anywhere in the British Empire outside the handful of flights the Wright brothers had achieved in America. It was morning, the lake still and white, the air cold enough that breath froze visible, that every sound carried sharp and clear across the emptiness. He watched from shore, an old man now, his beard white as the ice beneath the aircraft, his body less willing than it once had been. 62 years old, partially deaf, no longer able to do the physical work himself but still capable of vision, still able to gather young engineers around him and give them resources and freedom to pursue the questions he had asked but could not personally answer. The Aerial Experiment Association, they called themselves. A collective investigation into aviation's emerging possibilities, funded by his telephone royalties, guided by his conviction that systematic experimentation would reveal principles of controllable powered flight. Whispers tell us that the moment held both triumph and melancholy. Triumph because the silver dart worked, because it rose smoothly from the ice, its engine sputtering but reliable, its wings catching air and translating horizontal motion into lift. Melancholy because he was spectator rather than participant, because age had relegated him to shore while younger men piloted the machines his funding made possible, because the future belonged to them now in ways it no longer belonged to him. The aircraft circled above the lake, minutes only, perhaps 5 at most, covering less than a mile in that first flight. The engine noise echoed off surrounding hills, an industrial roar in landscape accustomed to silence, to wind and wave and the occasional call of birds. The silver dart looked impossibly delicate against the winter sky, its fabric wings translucent where sunlight struck them, its wooden frame visible through the covering, its pilot exposed to wind and cold, perched on simple seat with only rudimentary controls between him and catastrophe. But it flew. Sustained itself in air through the marriage of engine power and aerodynamic surfaces, through the Wright brothers' principles applied in Canadian winter, through the accumulated understanding of lift and drag and control that humanity had finally, after millennia of dreaming, begun to master. The dream of flight, ancient as myth, persistent as prayer, had become prosaic engineering problem, still dangerous, still requiring courage, but no longer impossible, no longer relegated to fantasy and wishful imagination. Beneath the silence after the engine cut and the silver dart settled back onto ice, successful landing, following successful flight, perhaps he felt the weight of transition. He had lived through transformation more complete than most humans ever witness. Had been born into world of horses and sail, of communication limited to speed of physical travel, of night defined by darkness and distance meaning isolation. Had lived to see electric light and telephone and automobile and now aircraft, had contributed significantly to several of these transformations, had participated in the reshaping of human civilization's relationship to darkness and distance and the limitations that geography imposed. It is said that he understood the silver dart's flight was beginning, not culmination. That aviation would develop rapidly now that the fundamental problems had been solved. That within his lifetime, though he had only 13 years remaining, aircraft would progress from fragile experimental craft to reliable transportation, would fight in wars and carry mail and passengers, would shrink the world the way telephone and steamship and telegraph had already shrunk it. Where memory fades into the cold and excitement of that February morning, we can imagine his thoughts as the silver dart circled overhead. Perhaps he thought of the tetrahedral kites, of his own aeronautical investigations that had explored different paths than the one the Wright brothers successfully traveled. Perhaps he felt vindication that the principles were sound, that human flight was now established fact rather than controversial claim. Perhaps he simply felt satisfaction at having enabled this moment, at having provided the resources and environment where young engineers could experiment freely, could fail safely, could learn through systematic variation what worked and what didn't. The Aerial Experiment Association would disband later that year, its mission accomplished, its members moving on to other projects and opportunities. They had built several aircraft before the Silver Dart, the Red Wing, the White Wing, each one teaching lessons, each failure narrowing the range of viable designs until finally the Silver Dart succeeded where its predecessors had fallen short. This was the method he had championed all his life: systematic experimentation, patient observation, willingness to learn from failure, conviction that sufficient persistence would eventually yield success. Marked by the Silver Dart's shadow crossing ice, by the sound of its engine echoing off hills, by the brief minutes when Canadian machine flew over Canadian landscape carrying Canadian pilot, the morning became historical moment. Not the most important moment in aviation history, the Wright brothers had achieved that 6 years earlier at Kitty Hawk, but significant nonetheless as proof that flight could be replicated, that the principles were understood well enough for others to apply them successfully, that aviation had become discipline rather than isolated achievement. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The Silver Dart's engine spoke of future arriving faster than anyone anticipated. Within decades, aircraft would cross oceans, would carry hundreds of passengers, would fly faster than sound, would reach altitudes where air grew too thin to breathe. The fragile sprucine fabric craft circling above frozen lake would seem quaint, primitive, but it would be ancestor to all that followed, would be part of the lineage leading to jets and rockets and human exploration of space itself. Beneath the silence after the flight, after the congratulations and photographs, after the technical discussions about what had worked and what needed improvement, after the satisfaction had settled into something quieter, perhaps he felt peace. The peace that comes from seeing work continued by capable hands, from knowing that the questions he had raised would be pursued by others, that the systematic methodology he had championed would outlast him, would continue generating understanding and practical application long after he was gone. Where wonder and succession meet, legacy forms. He had trained proteges, had gathered around him the young and curious, had given them not just funding but method, not just resources but approach, the conviction that systematic investigation yields results, that patience matters more than brilliance, that collaboration produces outcomes individuals cannot achieve alone. The Silver Dart was their achievement more than his, but his contribution was enabling them, providing the environment where such achievement could manifest. The frozen lake held witness. Ice that would melt come spring, that existed only temporarily but served in its season as runway for history, as platform for the first controlled, powered flight in Canada, as stage for moment that proved aviation had arrived, that human dominion over air was no longer theoretical but actual, no longer controversial but established, no longer miracle but engineering. It is said that photographs from that day show him bundled in winter coat, standing at lake's edge, watching the silver dart circle overhead. His expression is difficult to read in the old print's satisfaction perhaps, or contemplation, or the complex mixture of emotions that comes from witnessing the future arriving, from seeing dreams made actual through others' hands, from understanding that the work continues beyond any individual, that questions outlast questioners, that the systematic pursuit of understanding is species endeavor rather than personal achievement. Where the aircraft rose, aspiration became altitude. The ancient dream of flight, present in every culture's mythology, persistent through millennia of failure and fantasy, had finally yielded to systematic investigation. The silver dart circling above Badek was proof that humans could fly not through magic or divine intervention, but through engineering and persistence, through understanding principles and applying them methodically, through the patient accumulation of knowledge that transforms impossible into ordinary. Some believe the Aerial Experiment Association was his last significant contribution to innovation. But perhaps the contribution was never the specific aircraft or achievements, but the method itself, the systematic approach, the willingness to fund investigation without demanding immediate commercial return, the conviction that collaboration yields results individual genius cannot match, the patience to let young engineers learn through their own experimentation rather than simply executing his vision. The silver dart that broke the northern sky broke it in the sense of piercing what had been barrier, of demonstrating that Canadian winter could not prevent flight, that the principles worked in any climate, that aviation was not limited to specific locations or conditions, but was universal capability once understood, that aircraft stands in memory as testament to transition. From his generation to the next, from his active innovation to his role as patron and enabler. From his doing to his teaching, from his investigating to his supporting others' investigations. Where the lake remembers, if frozen water can remember, if place holds witness to what occurs upon it, the silver dart's shadow still crosses ice. Still circles in that 5-minute flight that proved so much, that established Canadian aviation, that brought the old inventor to Lake's Edge to watch younger hands accomplish what his funding made possible, what his method had suggested would eventually succeed, what his lifetime of systematic questioning had helped prepare the way for. The shadow crosses, the engine echoes. The future arrives on sprucing fabric wings, impossibly fragile, remarkably successful, proof that the dream of flight had become prosaic reality, that the sky was no longer limit but realm, that humanity had added third dimension to its domain through systematic investigation and patient refinement, and the accumulated understanding that sufficient persistence yields. Where wonder flew that morning, memory flies still. And in the flying, in the circling above ice, in the brief minutes when machine defied gravity and carried human body aloft there, the transformation was made visible. The world was different after the silver dart than before it, not dramatically, not obviously, but measurably. One more proof that the impossible was becoming ordinary. one more demonstration that systematic inquiry transforms limitation into capability. The northern sky, broken gently by fragile aircraft, would never quite be the same. And the old man watching from shore, having spent his life breaking barriers of silence and distance and darkness, saw in the silver dart's flight the continuation of work that would outlast him, that belonged now to younger hands, that would carry forward into future he could only imagine. Where the journey ends for one generation, it begins for another. And in that beginning, in that passing forward of method and questions, and the conviction that mysteries yield to patient investigation, there, legacy lives. Not in any single achievement, but in the continuation, the building upon, the carrying forward that the silver dart represented that cold February morning above Canadian ice. Speed on water obsessed him in his final decades, not the slow displacement of conventional boats plowing through waves, pushing water aside through sheer momentum, limited by the hull's resistance to the medium it traveled through. But something faster, more efficient boats that could rise above the surface on underwater wings, that could skim rather than plow, that could escape the drag that made high speeds on water prohibitively expensive in terms of power required. Hydrofoils. The word itself suggested the concept, foils beneath the water, shaped like aircraft wings, generating lift as the boat moved forward, raising the hull clear of the surface once sufficient speed was achieved. The principle was aerodynamic but applied to water, using the liquid's density to generate lift, allowing hulls to escape the friction and wave-making resistance that limited conventional marine vessels. It is said that he designed craft that looked like dragonflies' hulls suspended above water on spindly legs, foils submerged just deep enough to generate lift without excessive drag. The early prototypes were crude, often unstable, prone to porpoising the bow lifting too high, stalling the foils, dropping back to water, accelerating again in cycle that made control nearly impossible. But through systematic testing, through variation and observation and the accumulated understanding of how foil shape and position affected stability, the designs improved. In trials on Bras d'Or Lake, these experimental craft achieved speeds impossible for conventional boats of similar power. 40, 50, eventually 70 miles per hour across water, the hull racing above the surface like some strange insect supported by underwater wings, spray trailing behind like comet tails, the roar of engine and splash of spray echoing off hills surrounding the lake. Whispers tell us that the sensation of riding a hydrofoil was unlike anything else. The transition from displacement to foil-borne flight, the moment when the hull lifted clear, when resistance suddenly decreased and speed increased dramatically, felt almost magical. The ride became smoother as the hull rose above waves, became faster as drag decreased, became stranger as the boat skimmed across the surface in manner that violated every expectation about how vessels should move through water. But the technology was ahead of its time, as much of his late work was. The materials available in the early 20th century, wood and fabric, simple metal fittings, were barely adequate for the stresses hydrofoils imposed. The foils needed to be strong enough to support the boat's weight, precise enough in shape to generate stable lift, durable enough to withstand impact with debris or waves, yet light enough not to add prohibitive weight. Engines were underpowered for the speeds he envisioned. Control systems were crude. The understanding of hydrodynamics was incomplete. He was exploring territory where theory lagged behind experimentation, where accumulated observation mattered more than textbook knowledge because textbooks had not yet been written on hydrofoil design. Beneath the silence of those later years, for he was in his 70s now, the First World War was ending. The world he had known was transforming again. Beneath that silence, methodology persisted. The same approach that had yielded telephone and photophone now applied to marine engineering. Observe how the craft behaves. Form hypothesis about what modification might improve performance. Test the modification. Record results. Refine based on what was learned. Test again. It is said that his hydrofoil HD4 set a world marine speed record in 1919, 70.86 miles per hour, a mark that would stand for years. The craft was not beautiful in conventional sense, too angular, too mechanical, too obviously experimental. But it worked, proved that hydrofoils could achieve remarkable speeds, that the principle was sound even if implementation remained challenging. Where memory fades into the technical details, foil angles and hull shapes, engine specifications and control mechanisms, there remains the essential drive. Even in his 70s, curiosity undiminished, he continued questioning, continued investigating, continued refusing to accept that conventional wisdom about what was possible on water-defined permanent limits. If aircraft could fly by generating lift with wings, he reasoned, then boats could fly in a sense by generating lift with submerged foils. The principle was the same, only the medium differed. Perhaps it was never meant to revolutionize marine transportation in his lifetime. The hydrofoil, like the photophone before it, was technology awaiting its moment. Would not become practical until decades later, until better materials, aluminum alloys, later composites made foil construction lighter and stronger, until more powerful engines made high speeds more easily achievable, until control systems became sophisticated enough to manage the instabilities that plagued early designs. But he had proven the concept, had demonstrated that water could be transcended rather than merely traveled through, that resistance was not inevitable, but could be dramatically reduced through clever application of aerodynamic principles to marine problems. The hydrofoils he built and tested on Bras-d'Or Lake were ancestors to later developments: military patrol boats, passenger ferries, racing craft, all benefiting from principles he had explored and partially resolved. Marked by the spray of hydrofoils crossing the lake at impossible speeds, by the strange sight of hulls racing above water on underwater wings, by the systematic investigation of how lift and drag and stability interacted in marine environment, the hydrofoil experiments became final chapter in his catalog of investigations. not his most famous work, not the achievement for which he would be primarily remembered. But characteristic nonetheless, same curiosity, same systematic approach, same conviction that conventional limits were merely temporary boundaries awaiting systematic challenge. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The hydrofoils whispered truths about efficiency and speed, about how understanding principles in one domain, aerodynamics, could illuminate possibilities in another, marine engineering, about how systematic experimentation could reveal solutions that pure theory might overlook, about how the barrier between possible and impossible was always more permeable than conventional wisdom suggested. Beneath the silence of those final experiments, for they were his last significant technical investigations, undertaken while in his 70s, completed just years before his death, beneath that silence, satisfaction perhaps dwelt. The satisfaction of having spent entire life questioning, investigating, refusing to settle, pushing against boundaries in multiple disciplines, demonstrating that curiosity need not decline with age, that the systematic pursuit of understanding was worthy endeavor regardless of whether commercial success followed. Where wonder persisted, the laboratory remained active. Not just physical laboratory at Bainbridge, though that was real enough, machine shops and testing facilities, engineers and assistants, the accumulated apparatus of systematic investigation. But mental laboratory as well, the space where he continued asking questions, continued imagining possibilities, continued believing that sufficient persistence would eventually yield understanding. It is said that the hydrofoil work brought him joy in his final years. Not the fame or recognition, he had enough of both already, but the pure satisfaction of investigation itself, of watching craft rise on foils and skim across water at speeds conventional boats could not match, of seeing theory translate into practice through patient testing and refinement, of proving once more that the impossible was merely difficult, was problem awaiting systematic solution. The laboratory where water learned to fly stood on mountain overlooking Lake Bainbridge, the beautiful mountain, the estate he had built with telephone profits, the sanctuary where Mabel presided over domestic arrangements while he pursued technical obsessions in workshops scattered across the property. It was collaboration still, after 40 years of marriage, her managing the household, that made his work possible, him investigating questions that had captured his attention, both of them understanding that their partnership worked because it honored rather than erased their differences. Where the hydrofoils raced, questions raced with them. Questions about drag and lift, about stability and control, about how to make boats faster while using less power, about whether water's resistance could be minimized through geometry and motion rather than merely accepted as inevitable constraint. And in those questions, in that persistent wondering, the aged inventor remained himself, the boy from Edinburgh who had watched his deaf mother listen through piano vibrations, who had learned early that conventional perception was not the only perception, that barriers existed to be questioned and challenged and, where possible, overcome. Some believe the hydrofoil work was hobby, was elderly man's pastime rather than serious investigation. But the speed records suggest otherwise. The innovations in foil design suggest otherwise. The influence on later hydrofoil development suggests otherwise. He was serious, systematic, pursuing questions that mattered even if commercial application remained distant, even if the technology was premature, even if the work would not be fully vindicated until after his death. Where water learned to fly, the impossible became temporarily actual. The hydrofoils demonstrated what later generations would more fully realize, that marine vessels need not accept water's drag as destiny, that speed on water could be dramatically increased through clever engineering, that the principles governing flight in air applied also to motion through liquid. The lake held witness. Brasdor's waters, usually calm, occasionally disturbed by experimental craft racing across surface on underwater wings, spray trailing behind, engines roaring, hulls suspended improbably above the element they traveled through. The lake would outlast the experiments, would return to quietness after he died, after the hydrofoil testing ended, after the workshops fell silent. But the memory persisted, in photographs of strange craft skimming water, in notebooks documenting tests and modifications, in the record speed that stood for years, in the proof that systematic investigation could yield results even in old age, even in domains where he had no formal training, even in technologies that would not become practical until long after he was gone. Where the laboratory stood, the mountain still rises. Bainbrig overlooking Brasdor Lake, the estate that was his summer sanctuary, his retreat from Boston's obligations, his place for pursuing questions without commercial pressure, without expectation that every investigation must yield immediate practical application. The workshops are quiet now, or repurposed, or gone. But what they witnessed remains: the patient testing, the systematic variation, the accumulated understanding that came from watching water learn to fly beneath experimental hulls. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The hydrofoils spoke of persistence that outlasted conventional career, of curiosity that refused to retire, of systematic methodology that remained effective regardless of investigators' age or domain of inquiry. They spoke of late-life joy in pure investigation, in the satisfaction that comes from watching theory become practice, from seeing modification improve performance, from proving once more that sufficient patience yields understanding. Where wonder raced across water, leaving spray and speed records and photographs of impossible craft doing impossible things, there, the final chapter of his investigations unfolded. Not ending with triumph or tragedy, but simply continuing until he could no longer continue, until age and illness finally imposed limits that systematic methodology could not overcome, until the questions that had driven him for 8 decades finally fell silent. But the questions themselves did not die. They passed forward to others who would continue the hydrofoil work, who would benefit from his investigations, who would build on principles he had explored and partially resolved. The laboratory where water learned to fly became seedbed for later developments, became proof that premature technology still serves purpose, that investigation ahead of its time still contributes to eventual understanding. Where the journey nears its end, the method persists. And in that persistence, in that carrying forward of systematic investigation, the laboratory's work continues not in the specific craft or speed records, but in the example of curiosity maintained, of questions pursued regardless of age, of the conviction that understanding is always worth seeking even when practical application remains distant. The water learned to fly. And in the learning, impossibility became temporarily actual, became demonstration, became proof that limits are often merely boundaries awaiting challenge, that systematic investigation can transcend conventional wisdom, that the distance between cannot and can is measured not in inspiration but in patient, devoted, systematic work. Bainbrig Beautiful Mountain rose above Bras d'Or Lake in Nova Scotia, and there he built his summer estate, his retreat from Boston's heat and obligations, his sanctuary where questions could be pursued without commercial pressure or social expectation. The house commanded views across water to distant hills, across landscape that seemed unchanged since glaciers carved it into current form, across wilderness that reminded him perhaps of his Scottish origins, of Edinburgh Hills where his questioning had begun. But more than residence, Bainbrig became laboratory, workshop, gathering place for the curious and inventive. A fortress not of stone but of inquiry, not defended against enemies, but open to anyone willing to pursue systematic investigation, to ask questions and test answers, to participate in the ongoing conversation between human curiosity and natural law. It is said that young engineers arrived each summer to work on projects aviation, hydrofoils, medical devices, anything that captured his restless attention. They came because he paid well, yes, but also because Bainbrig offered something more valuable than wages. It offered freedom to investigate, to fail safely, to learn through experimentation rather than merely executing established procedures. It offered the model of systematic inquiry applied across disciplines, the conviction that the same methods that had yielded telephone and photophone could yield understanding in any domain if applied with sufficient patience. The laboratory buildings multiplied over the years, machine shops and testing facilities, hangars for experimental aircraft, spaces dedicated to photography, for he was pioneering photographer as well, documenting his experiments, understanding that visual record mattered, that images could communicate what words alone could not. Chemical laboratories where assistants processed film and investigated materials. Darkrooms where photographs emerged from light-sensitive paper like memories becoming tangible. Whispers tell us that he walked the mountain paths daily when health permitted, observing weather patterns, watching birds how they banked and turned, how they managed stability in wind, how they accomplished with muscle and feather what humans attempted with engine and strut. Noting how natural systems solved problems engineers struggled with, how evolution had explored possibilities human design had not yet considered. The estate became its own kind of university, informal, unstructured, dedicated not to certificates or formal education, but to pure investigation, to the systematic pursuit of understanding for its own sake. The students and assistants worked not toward degrees but toward breakthroughs, not accumulating credits but accumulating knowledge, not preparing for careers but participating in active investigation that might or might not yield practical results. Beneath the silence of those summer seasons when Boston seemed distant, when the telephone business ran itself or was managed by others, when he could focus on questions rather than administration, beneath that silence, a culture developed. The culture of collaborative investigation, of shared curiosity, of respect for systematic method regardless of whether it yielded commercially valuable results. Mabel presided over the social aspects, organized gatherings and dinners, created the domestic infrastructure that made the technical work possible. She could not hear the conversations that filled the evening rooms, those animated discussions of foil angles and engine specifications, of photographic techniques and hydrofoil stability. But she could sense the excitement, could read in faces and gestures the progress of experiments, the frustration of failures, the satisfaction of breakthroughs achieved through persistent questioning. It is said that their marriage had become, by this late stage, a partnership of comfortable accommodation, each understanding the other's domains, each respecting the other's needs. He with his workshops and experiments, his questions and investigations that continued unabated into his 70s. She with her household management, her social arrangements, her own interests in gardening and family matters. Together creating environment where his work could continue, where young engineers could gather, where systematic investigation could proceed without the commercial pressures that had defined his earlier career, where memory fades into the accumulated seasons at Bainbridge. We can imagine the quality of life there, the rhythm of investigation and observation. The morning walks where he noted weather and wildlife, the afternoon workshops where assistants built apparatus according to his sketches, the evening discussions where results were analyzed and next steps planned, the comfortable routine of systematic inquiry made possible by wealth accumulated through earlier inventions, dedicated now to questions that might never yield commercial return, but yielded something perhaps more valuable, understanding for its own sake. The mountain held them both. Held his investigation and her patient management, held the workshops and the gardens, held the young engineers who arrived each summer to participate in experiments, to learn systematic methodology, to experience the culture of collaborative investigation that he had pioneered at Menlo Park decades earlier with Edison's muckers as model, though his approach was gentler, more collegial, less driven by commercial urgency. Perhaps it was never meant to produce specific breakthroughs. Perhaps Bainbrigh's purpose was different, to demonstrate that investigation could continue throughout life, that curiosity need not decline with age, that the systematic pursuit of understanding was worthy endeavor regardless of commercial outcome. To provide space where questions could be asked freely, where failures were learning opportunities rather than disasters, where the journey of investigation mattered as much as any destination reached. Marked by the mountain itself, by its stable presence through changing seasons, by its offering of perspective across water to distant horizons, by its provision of space where inquiry could proceed at its own pace, Bain Brig became monument, not to any specific achievement but to the process of investigation itself, to the conviction that questions matter, that systematic methodology yields understanding, that the pursuit of knowledge is human activity worthy of lifetime devotion. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The mountain spoke of permanence and patience, of the long view that comes from elevated perspective, of the recognition that individual investigations matter less than the cumulative effect of sustained curiosity, that any single experiment might fail but the approach itself, consistently applied, would eventually yield results. Beneath the silence of mountain evenings, after workshops closed and assistants retired, after Mabel had managed dinner and domestic arrangements, after the day's investigations had been recorded in notebooks that would eventually fill shelves in the library, beneath that silence, perhaps he reflected on the journey from Edinburgh to Nova Scotia, from deaf boy watching his mother to aged inventor surrounded by young engineers, from basement chemistry experiments to telephone that spanned continents, from single questions to lifetime of systematic inquiry. Where wonder dwelt, the fortress stood, not fortress against enemies but fortress of questions, defended only against the assumption that mystery must remain mysterious, that conventional wisdom defined permanent limits, that the impossible was anything more than the not yet accomplished awaiting sufficient persistence to make it actual. It is said that he died there at Bain Brig in August 1922. Not in workshop or laboratory, but in the residence, in bed, surrounded by family, his body finally failing after 7 to 5 years of mostly robust health, his mind remaining sharp nearly to the end. He had lived to see the telephone become global infrastructure, had witnessed the airplane develop from experimental craft to military weapon to commercial transportation, had contributed to multiple transformations of human civilization, had demonstrated through his own example that systematic investigation could yield results across disciplines, that curiosity could be profession, that the pursuit of understanding was worthy of lifetime devotion. The mountain held him in death as it had held him in life. He was buried there, overlooking the lake where hydrofoils had raced and the silver dart had flown, the waters reflecting sky just as telephone had reflected voice across distance, just as all his work had been reflection of systematic curiosity that would not rest, that treated mystery as invitation rather than boundary, that believed sufficient questioning would eventually reveal nature's principles. Where the fortress stood, where it still stands, transformed now into museum or memorial or private property, the specifics matter less than the principle there. Legacy persisted, not in buildings or apparatus, though some remain, but in the example itself, the life lived in systematic questioning, the conviction that understanding is possible, the faith that patient investigation yields results. The demonstration that curiosity can sustain entire career, entire life, that the pursuit of knowledge need not justify itself through commercial success, but carries its own justification in the understanding achieved. Some believe the fortress of questions was Bainbrig itself, the physical place, the mountain estate, the workshops and laboratories. But perhaps the true fortress was more portable, more personal. Perhaps it was the methodology itself, the systematic approach that he carried with him wherever he went, that structured his investigations, whether in Boston boarding house or Nova Scotia estate, that remained constant through decades of changing interests and questions. Where wonder built its fortress, barriers fell. The barrier between sound and silence crossed by telephone, between distance and connection overcome by voice transmission, between conventional limits and actual possibilities, challenged by systematic investigation in multiple domains, between the impossible and the merely difficult, dissolved through patient persistence and refusal to accept that what had always been must always remain. The fortress stands in memory, physical structure transformed, its function changed, but its meaning persistent. It stands as reminder that questions matter, that systematic investigation yields understanding, that the pursuit of knowledge is noble endeavor worthy of lifetime devotion, that curiosity can be cultivated and sustained, that wonder, properly channeled through methodology and patience, can transform not just individual understanding but human civilization itself. Where the mountain rises, the fortress endures, not as building but as principle, not as place but as approach, not as historical site but as continuing invitation to anyone willing to question systematically, to investigate patiently, to pursue understanding for its own sake rather than merely for commercial gain. The fortress of questions on the mountain holds its silence now. But in that silence echo persists, the echo of a life spent questioning, of investigations pursued across disciplines, of systematic methodology applied to mysteries in acoustics and aviation, in marine engineering and photography, in any domain where curiosity suggested possibilities and patience revealed principles. And in that echo, the invitation remains to question, to investigate, and to pursue understanding with the conviction that mysteries yield to patient inquiry, that the impossible is merely the not yet accomplished, that the distance between ignorance and knowledge is crossed not through inspiration alone, but through systematic, devoted, persistent work. Where the fortress stood, questions still dwell, waiting for the next curious mind, the next systematic investigator, the next person willing to spend lifetime pursuing understanding rather than merely accepting conventional wisdom about what is possible and what must remain forever beyond human comprehension. On the day they buried him, August 4, 1922, telephone service across North America fell silent, not by accident or technical failure, but by design, a tribute planned and coordinated, a moment when the system he had created would pause to acknowledge his passing. At 6:30 in the evening Eastern Time, for one full minute, the entire network went quiet. Millions of calls suspended, millions of conversations interrupted. The grid that carried voice across continents temporarily stilled in recognition of the man whose systematic investigation had made it possible. It is said that in cities and towns, in homes and offices, in hotels and hospitals, and anywhere the telephone had reached, which by 1922 was nearly everywhere in developed North America, people received advance notice to prepare for the silence. Operators informed callers that at the designated time, service would cease for 60 seconds. Newspapers published announcements. The word spread through the very network that would soon fall quiet, spreading through the infrastructure he had pioneered, reaching every node in the vast web of copper and switches and exchange buildings that constituted modern telephone service. When the moment arrived, the silence was strange, almost uncomfortable. The telephone had become so woven into daily life, so assumed and unremarkable, that its absence even for a minute felt disorienting. People stood with receivers in hand, listening to the emptiness where the hum of connection should have been. The absence was more present than most presences, more noticeable than the working service people took for granted every other minute of every other day. But the silence was also fitting. He had spent his life making sound travel, making voice persist across distance, making communication possible where separation should have meant isolation. Now in death, he received tribute in the form he would have understood, not in speeches or ceremonies, though those occurred as well, but in the temporary restoration of the silence his invention had interrupted. In the brief return of the world as it had been before telephone, before his systematic investigation had translated voice into electrical signal, and back into sound arriving at distant receivers. Whispers tell us that people wept during that minute. Not because they had known him personally, most had not, but because the silence made them suddenly aware of what they took for granted. The miracle they commanded casually dozens of times daily without thought or wonder. The impossible made so ordinary through his persistence that entire generations had grown up never knowing a world where distance meant isolation, where voice could not cross hundreds or thousands of miles through the simple mechanism of lifted receiver and dialed number. Then the minute passed. The service resumed, conversations picked up where they had been interrupted. The world returned to its new normal, the connected world, the world where voices spanned continents, where presence could be maintained despite separation, where the telephone was infrastructure rather than wonder, utility rather than miracle. Beneath the silence of that commemorative minute, something profound had been acknowledged. That one person's systematic investigation could reshape civilization. That the accumulation of patient observations and careful experiments could translate impossibility into everyday assumption. That the distance from this cannot be done to this is how things work was measured not in inspiration, but in devoted, systematic, persistent effort. Where memory fades into the details of the funeral itself, the ceremony at Bainbrig, the burial on the mountain overlooking the lake where he had tested hydrofoils and watched the silver dart fly, the gathering of family and colleagues and dignitaries who had come to pay respects, there remains the essential recognition. He had changed the world. not through single invention alone, though the telephone would have been sufficient legacy by itself, but through demonstration of systematic methodology, through the conviction that mysteries yield to patient inquiry, through the lifetime of questions pursued across disciplines with unwavering faith that sufficient persistence would eventually reveal nature's principles. It is said that Mabel, his wife of 4 to 5 years, stood at the graveside in silence that was natural to her, that had defined her existence since childhood. For her, this formal silence was simply continuation of the silence she always inhabited. But perhaps she understood better than the hearing mourners what the tribute meant, that silence, which is usually absence for the hearing, had become presence for a minute, had become memorial and acknowledgement, had become the way the hearing world chose to recognize the man who had made their acoustic connection possible. Marked by that minute of stillness, by the temporary absence of service that made service suddenly visible and valuable, by the collective recognition of what had been accomplished and what it meant for human civilization, marked by all this, the funeral became not just personal loss but cultural moment, the end of an era, perhaps. The passing of a generation that had witnessed and participated in fundamental transformations from gas to electric light, from silence to telephone, from horse to automobile, from earthbound to flight capable, from isolated to connected. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. In the silence of that commemorative minute, millions of voices were prevented from speaking. But in their silence, they spoke volumes about the transformation telephone had wrought, about the assumption of connection that had replaced the old assumption of isolation, about the infrastructure that had become so reliable that its brief suspension shocked people into awareness of what they usually took for granted. Where wonder and forgetting met, the minute of silence forced remembering. A forced recognition that the telephone was not inevitable or natural, but was the product of specific persons' systematic investigation, specific set of questions pursued with specific methodology, specific accumulation of observations and experiments that had transformed possibility into actuality. Beneath the silence, gratitude stirred, perhaps unspoken, perhaps not fully conscious, but present nonetheless. Gratitude for the ability to hear distant voices, to maintain connection across separation, to treat distance as irrelevance rather than obstacle, to live in world where loved ones could be reached with gesture as simple as lifting receiver, where isolation was choice rather than geographic inevitability, where the human voice had become as portable as human thought. The silence honored sound. Specifically, it honored the making of sound portable, the translation of voice into electrical signal, the systematic investigation that had revealed how acoustic vibrations could be converted to current and back to vibration, could span distances that unassisted voice could never cross, could make presence possible despite absence. It is said that when service resumed after the minute ended, the volume of calls surged, as though people needed to verify that the connection was restored, that the silence had been temporary, that the telephone still worked as it always had. Or perhaps they simply felt sudden awareness of how much they valued the service, how dependent they had become on the ability to communicate across distance, how central telephone had become to daily life. Where the silence ended, acknowledgement persisted, not just in that moment but in the decades since. Every telephone call is, in a sense, continuation of his work, every voice that travels electrically, every conversation that treats distance as irrelevant, every connection maintained despite separation, all of them descendants of his systematic investigation. All of them proof that what he accomplished matters still, matters perhaps more than ever in increasingly connected world where his principle has expanded beyond audio to video, beyond voice to data, beyond telephone to internet and all the ways humans now communicate across distance. The silence that honored sound was brief, 60 seconds only. But in that brevity, it contained recognition that would outlast the silence itself. Recognition that systematic investigation can transform civilization, that patient questioning yields understanding, that the impossible is merely the not yet accomplished, that one person's curiosity, properly focused and persistently pursued, can reshape how billions of people live and communicate and maintain connection across the spaces that divide them. Some believe the minute of silence was inadequate tribute, too brief for what he accomplished. Others believe it was perfect concentrated acknowledgement, focused awareness, brief interruption that made people suddenly conscious of what they usually took for granted. Perhaps both views contain truth. The tribute was brief because it needed to be. Service could not be suspended indefinitely. Life continued. Connections needed maintaining. The world moved forward, but in moving forward it carried his contribution with it, carried the telephone and the principles it embodied, carried the systematic methodology he had demonstrated, carried the conviction that mysteries yield to patient inquiry, that understanding is possible, that the distance between ignorance and knowledge can be crossed through devoted, systematic, persistent work. Where memory fades into the general flow of history, the minute of silence remains specific moment when millions of people across continent simultaneously acknowledged what one person's systematic investigation had made possible. When they honored not just the inventor but the invention, not just the man but the method, not just the breakthrough but the approach that had made breakthrough possible. The silence honored sound. But more than sound, it honored the systematic questioning that had made sound portable, the patient investigation that had translated voice into electrical signal, the persistent curiosity that had refused to accept that distance must mean isolation, that separation must mean the end of conversation, that the impossible must remain impossible rather than becoming, through sufficient devotion, merely historical. Where the silence dwelt that evening in August 1922, tribute lived. A tribute to curiosity, to persistence, to systematic methodology, to the conviction that understanding is possible, that mysteries yield to patient inquiry, that the human voice that most intimate of productions could be made to travel anywhere copper wire could reach, could cross oceans and continents, could maintain presence despite absence, could prove that connection transcends distance when technology provides the means and systematic investigation reveals the method. The silence lasted 1 minute. But its meaning echoes still through every telephone call, through every voice that travels electrically, through every moment when distance proves irrelevant because the telephone, his telephone, born from his systematic investigation, makes presence possible despite separation. Where wonder and gratitude meet, silence speaks. And in that August silence, the world spoke its recognition, brief but profound, temporary but meaningful, acknowledging that he had changed everything, that the world would never be quite the same after his life and work, that the distance he had helped overcome would remain overcome, would continue shrinking as his principles expanded into new technologies, new forms of connection, new ways of maintaining presence across the spaces that separate us. The silence honored sound. And in the honoring, memory became promise that the work would continue, that the questions would persist, that systematic investigation would yield further understanding, that the impossible would continue becoming possible as long as curious minds refused to accept mystery as permanent, as long as patient investigators followed his example of devoted, systematic, persistent questioning of nature's principles. It is said that sound never truly disappears, that every word spoken, every note sung, every vibration produced continues radiating outward at the speed of sound, growing fainter with distance and time, but never completely ceasing, echoing through the universe in waves too subtle for human ears to detect but physically present nonetheless, traveling until the universe itself ends or transforms beyond recognition. If this is true, and physics suggests it might be, that energy disperses but does not vanish, that acoustic vibrations become heat and entropy but never fully disappear, then the first words transmitted by telephone still travel somewhere. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," still radiating outward from that Boston boarding house, still carrying the urgency of spilled acid and the wonder of accomplished impossibility. Still propagating through space at the speed of sound, growing infinitely faint but never reaching absolute zero, never completely ceasing to exist. His voice persists not just in this metaphorical sense, not just in the physical waves that might still carry information about those first transmitted words, but in the principle he proved that sound could be transformed and transmitted, that voice could cross distance, that separation need not mean silence. Every telephone call since has been echo of that first transmission, variation on the theme he established, continuation of the conversation he began between systematic investigation and practical application, between curiosity about acoustic phenomena and technology that makes voice portable. Whispers tell us that his influence extends beyond the telephone itself. The methodology matters as much as any specific device. The systematic approach to investigation: observe carefully, form hypothesis, test rigorously, record results, refine based on what was learned, test again. This approach became model for industrial research, for the entire enterprise of translating scientific principle into practical technology. Before him, inventors worked mostly alone, pursued personal obsessions with limited resources. After him, organized research laboratories proliferated. Corporations established systematic programs for developing new technologies. The process of innovation became institutionalized. Whether this transformation was entirely beneficial is debatable. Systematic methodology can yield understanding, but it can also stifle creativity, can privilege incremental refinement over revolutionary breakthrough, can make innovation serve commercial interests rather than pure curiosity. But the possibility had been demonstrated. Investigation could be organized, supported, sustained. The individual genius toiling in isolation was not the only model. Collaboration could produce results individuals could not achieve alone. Beneath the silence of the decades since his death and over a century has now passed, his presence persists, not as ghost or spirit, not in any supernatural sense, but as legacy embedded in infrastructure, as method woven into culture, as example inspiring those who come after to ask their own questions, pursue their own investigations, apply systematic methodology to whatever mysteries capture their attention. The deaf students he taught have long since passed beyond. But their descendants, everyone who has benefited from his work with visible speech, everyone who has learned to communicate despite deafness, everyone whose understanding of acoustic phenomena was shaped by his investigations, these descendants carry forward something of his contribution, not always visibly, not always acknowledged, but present nonetheless in the accumulated culture of education for the deaf, in the technologies that translate speech into other forms, in the recognition that those who cannot hear are not lacking but perceiving differently. It is said that Mabel, his wife, survived him by only a few months, that she died in January 1923, perhaps unable or unwilling to continue without him, perhaps released by his passing from the partnership that had defined her adult life. They are buried together on the mountain overlooking the lake, the graves marked but not ostentatious, the monument acknowledging contribution without claiming more importance than is fitting. Where memory fades into the general flow of history, specific details blur but principles persist. We remember him primarily for the telephone. This is reasonable. It was his most significant contribution to human civilization, the invention that most dramatically transformed how people communicate across distance. But remembering only the telephone misses the larger pattern, the lifetime of systematic investigation, the willingness to pursue questions across disciplines, the conviction that mysteries yield to patient inquiry. The demonstration that curiosity can be profession, that investigation can be sustained throughout life, that the pursuit of understanding is worthy endeavor regardless of whether every investigation yields commercially valuable results. Perhaps the echo that continues calling is not in any specific technology but in the approach itself, the systematic methodology, the patient persistence, the refusal to accept conventional wisdom about what is possible. The conviction that sufficient questioning will eventually reveal nature's principles. This echo resonates through every research laboratory, through every systematic investigation, through every person who treats mystery as invitation rather than boundary, who believes that understanding is achievable through devoted inquiry. Marked by the countless voices that have traveled through telephone lines since that first transmission in 1876, by the global network that now connects billions of people across every continent, by the expansion of his principle into technologies he never imagined, video calls and data transmission, and the entire internet that is, in a sense, elaboration on the fundamental idea that distance can be overcome through electrical transmission of information, marked by all this. His legacy persists, not static but evolving, not finished but continuing, not monument but living example. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. His voice, not his acoustic voice, which has long since fallen completely silent, but his metaphorical voice, the message his life and work conveyed. That voice echoes still for those willing to hear it. It speaks of the power of systematic investigation, of the possibility of transformation through patient questioning, of the distance between impossible and inevitable, which is measured not in inspiration but in devoted, systematic, persistent work. Where wonder lives, the echo continues. In every question asked by minds that refuse to accept mystery as permanent, in every investigation that treats the impossible as merely difficult, in every demonstration that conventional limits are often temporary boundaries awaiting systematic challenge. In every connection maintained across distance, because he proved that voice could be translated into electrical signal and back into sound, arriving at distant receivers. Beneath the silence of a century, the echo grows no fainter. If anything, it grows stronger, amplified by the technologies that have elaborated on his principle, by the global connectivity that his telephone anticipated and initiated, by the understanding that his systematic methodology continues to generate in domain after domain, where curious minds apply his approach to whatever questions capture their attention. It is said that progress builds on previous progress, that each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before. He stood on shoulders to his father's work with visible speech, the telegraph operator's understanding of electrical communication, the accumulated knowledge of acoustics and electricity that was available in the 19th century. But he added something essential, added the systematic investigation, added the patient persistence, added the conviction that sufficient questioning would eventually yield understanding, added the demonstration that one person's curiosity, properly focused and persistently pursued, could transform how billions of people communicate and connect. The echo that continues calling carries this message forward. It calls to anyone willing to listen, to anyone curious enough to question, to anyone patient enough to pursue systematic investigation, even when answers seem distant, even when the impossible appears permanently impossible, even when conventional wisdom declares that certain mysteries must remain forever closed to human understanding. Where the journey began in Edinburgh household, where his deaf mother listened through piano vibrations, where his father taught visible speech, where a boy learned that sound was more than hearing, that communication took many forms, that barriers existed to be questioned rather than accepted there. The foundation was laid. But the journey did not end with his death, could not end. Because the questions he raised continue echoing, continue calling, continue inviting investigation by those who come after. Perhaps it was never about him specifically. Perhaps it was always about the method, the approach, the conviction that mysteries yield to patient inquiry. He was representative, not unique. What he accomplished, others might have accomplished, perhaps would have accomplished eventually, even without his specific contributions. But he did accomplish it, did demonstrate the method's power, did prove that systematic investigation transforms impossibility into actuality. And in that demonstration, in that lifetime of questioning pursued across disciplines with unwavering faith in the power of persistent inquiry, there, legacy lives. Not in monuments or accolades, though those exist, but in the continuation, in the carrying forward, in every person who hears the echo and responds by asking their own questions, pursuing their own investigations, applying systematic methodology to whatever mysteries capture their attention. Some believe progress is inevitable, that technologies develop according to their own logic regardless of individual contributions. Others believe individual genius matters, that specific people at specific moments make choices that redirect the entire stream of development. Perhaps both views contain truth. Perhaps Bell was inevitable. Someone would have invented the telephone, but his specific approach, his systematic methodology, his lifetime of persistent questioning across disciplines mattered nonetheless, shaped how the inevitable unfolded, influenced what came after in ways that different inventor with different approach might not have achieved. Where memory and promise meet, the echo calls loudest, memory of what he accomplished, promise that the work continues. Memory of systematic investigation yielding understanding, promise that curiosity properly applied will continue yielding breakthroughs, memory of the impossible becoming ordinary, promise that mysteries remaining will yield to patient inquiry just as mysteries past yielded to his questioning. The echo continues calling, through every telephone call, through every voice that travels electrically, through every connection maintained across distance, through every systematic investigation in any domain. Through every refusal to accept conventional limits as permanent, through every demonstration that patient persistence yields understanding, through every question asked by minds that treat mystery as invitation rather than boundary, where the echo dwells, possibility expands, the possibility that understanding is achievable, that mysteries yield to patient inquiry, that the impossible is merely the not yet accomplished. That sufficient devotion to systematic investigation will eventually translate darkness into comprehension, ignorance into knowledge, the boundaries that limit us into thresholds we can cross. Beneath the silence that honored sound, the silence his deaf wife and mother inhabited, the silence that is not absence but different presence, beneath all these silences, the echo calls, calls to the curious, calls to the persistent. Calls to anyone willing to question systematically, to investigate patiently, to pursue understanding with the conviction that nature's principles can be discovered, that mysteries can be solved, that the distance between where we are and where we might be is crossed not through magic or luck, but through devoted, systematic, persistent work. It is said that he never stopped questioning. That even in his final years, even as his body weakened, his mind remained active, remained curious, remained convinced that mysteries remained to be solved, that investigation was worthy pursuit regardless of age, that the systematic approach to understanding should continue until consciousness itself finally ceased. And so it did, until August 1922. Until the final silence, until the journey that began in Edinburgh household ended on Nova Scotia mountain. Until the voice that had spent lifetime making sound portable finally fell permanently silent, but the echo continues, will always continue, as long as curious minds ask questions, as long as investigators pursue understanding systematically, as long as the telephone rings and voices cross distances and connections are maintained despite separation. As long as mystery exists to be questioned and patience exists to pursue answers and systematic methodology exists to translate curiosity into understanding. Where the echo calls, we answer, by asking our own questions, by pursuing our own investigations, by continuing the conversation he began between human curiosity and natural law, between the impossible and the actual, between mystery and understanding. The echo that continues calling carries simple message, profound in its simplicity. Question, investigate, persist. The mysteries yield, the impossible becomes actual, the distance closes, understanding awaits patient, inevitable, accessible to anyone willing to listen to the echo and follow where it leads. And in the following, wonder lives eternal. Rest now. Let the echo fade gently. Let the questions dissolve into sleep. The conversation continues whether we wake or dream. The voice travels on. As it always has, as it always will, where wonder dwells, connection persists. And in the silence, the echo calls still soft, persistent, eternal. Good night.